Today I'm going to talk about computers and communication. Key idea of this talk is that technology is a path, not a thing. I call this the ambivalence of technology. It can develop along several different paths. It's not just fixed to one purpose, one function, one meaning. Now, the illustration we'll have here concerns the introduction of communication into the world of computing. There's a pattern to this which I'm going to illustrate in several different ways. Usually communication technologies start out with an inventor, often at a company, and the emphasis at first is on the transmission of information. That's what's considered important. But later, users get involved and they change the orientation of the technology toward communication, because for them, that's what's most important. So this is then a pattern of development of communication technologies, from information to communication. Here's a first illustration. The early telephone was designed for and used by business and government. There were official purposes that had to be served by this communication technology. But women got into the act and began to use the telephone for social life. Here's an interesting quote from a telephone company engineer who in 1909 complained about what he considered the misuse or abuse of his beautiful technology. He wrote, "The telephone is going beyond its original design, and it is a positive fact that a large percentage of telephones in use today on a flat rental basis are used more in entertainment, diversion, social intercourse, and accommodation to others than in actual cases of business or household necessity." Here's an illustration of the social telephone from a postcard at the end of the 19th century. "Let us beware of spooning and mooning." Something similar happened to the internet. Its original inventors, these engineers who designed the first software for what was later to become the internet, were charged with building a system for the transmission of data between mainframe computers at universities. The idea was that calculations could be done where there was free time on a computer around the country. But one of them decided that if you could send the data for the calculations, you could also send an email. And he created the first email program on what was to become the internet. And pretty soon, that's what most of the usage turned out to be. The Pentagon was a bit worried since they were financing this operation. And there was actually a meeting at which they decided to permit the use of email on the internet. And just wind that forward to today, and you see what that means. The main example I'm going to develop here is the French Teletel system. This was a kind of first draft of the internet. The first time a computer network penetrated the home. So this is domestic computer networking. Before then, it was all professional and pretty restricted in terms of the number of people. The Teletel was introduced in France in 1981. It was designed as a strategy of modernization. The phone system in France was terrible, so they were going to leapfrog the telephone into the next generation of communication technology. And they mobilized the telephone company to make it happen. Teletel is the name of the network the telephone company created, and Minitel is the name of the terminal. So this system was supposed to realize a sociological discovery, the discovery that we were leaving the age, the industrial age, and entering the information age. The information age required the widespread delivery of information to all households, all human beings who could possibly play a role in the economy. In the post-industrial information age economy, knowledge was the primary good. And so this is why it was so important to computerize society. There was a technology available, a software useful for this purpose, called videotext, which delivered pages of data to terminals. So think of it as a little bit like the online manuals for your printer. You can get a lot of information across in this way. Well, two civil servants who were well-versed in the theory of post-industrial society, Nora and Mank, wrote a famous document for the government in 1978 in which they argued that France had to get ahead of the competition and enter the information age as quickly as possible by creating a domestic computing network. A lot of countries were trying this at the time. So this is the 1980s, right? Long before our present glorious age of universal social networking. There were attempts in England and Germany, and these attempts in the United States, and all of these attempts failed to take off. The secret of the French success was an integrated system that included both the terminal and the network. In some of the other systems, you had to buy a set-top box to turn your television into a terminal so you could see videotext pages from the network. The French learned from experience that this was not going to work. They distributed 9 million terminals free. And these terminals were then served by companies that hooked up to the network with their own computers and offered services, all kinds of services. Things like the advertisements in the newspaper could instead be delivered by videotext on the network. The users paid for each minute of connection to each service, and that's how the system was financed. So here's the Minitel terminal. It's like a little computer, except without much memory or computing power. All it can really do is display pages of text. And here's the construction of the network. You can see on the left the Minitel terminal. It's connected through the phone system to a central sort of switching device, which then sends it out to the servers of the various services operating on the network. And here's the directory of services. You can see each service has a code by which you can access it and a little description of what it can do for you. Well, this was a success. They pretty quickly had 25 million users, nearly half the population. In 1966, there were about 26,000 services. 10,000 companies were offering these services, and they were raking in about $1 billion a year. In 2007, of course, the internet is well established by then. They were still generating over $100 million a year in revenue, because there were certain services on the system that were better than anything you could find on the internet. For example, services for reserving seats on trains or a national telephone directory. But in 2012, they closed down the Minitel system and everyone switched to the internet. So how did they do it? The big problem all these services faced was a kind of chicken and egg dilemma. Why would anyone sign on to a system that didn't have services? And why would anyone put a server on let me start over. Why would anyone sign on to a system without services? And why would anyone put a service on a system without users? So where do you start? Well, the government in France figured out that it would start with free terminals. That way, at least there would be the possibility of multiple users so that the service providers could be confident that someone would check in on their service. And the terminals also had the effect of standardizing the interface. So just as we have a fairly standard interface with browsers for the internet, this is when computing was computers were much weaker. You could only really standardize the interface through the terminal itself, where function keys would allow you to do things that we do with the browser, like going forward, going backward, looking at the service menu, and so on. So ease of use was guaranteed, and users were guaranteed. And then they did one more clever thing. They opened the marketplace up to anyone who wanted to hook up a server with relatively few bureaucratic obstacles, which of course is miraculous for France. The result was that thousands of people, as we've seen, signed up to put their services on the network. And that made it interesting for users and so on, a virtuous circle instead of a chicken and egg. However, things did not go exactly as planned. In 1982, a year after the system started up, users hacked one of the networks on the system, one of the servers on the system, and improvised what was called pink messaging. Pink messaging was what we call chatting, and it took over. And it was lucrative, of course, for these system operators of the services, so they introduced programs to make it work better than it could by a simple hack. And pretty soon, the users were transformed from consumers of information into communicators. Half the online hours were soon dedicated to online messaging. In 1983, the whole system crashed because of the flood of users accessing these messaging services. And other applications besides chatting appeared. Advice columns operated online, political discussions. There was a student strike in 1986 that was coordinated online. The key feature of these messaging systems was anonymity. And this is a famous cartoon. On the internet, no one knows you're a dog. This was the spirit in which people engaged in the messaging on the Minitel system. And that had some interesting consequences. Pink messaging very quickly became the key to finding sexual partners. And here's the advertisements for some of the services. One is called La Voix du Parano, the voice of the paranoid. And they're advertising 7,000 users per day. The other is called Le Plaisir, pleasure. And it's all about having fun with partners who you find on the internet. Okay, but despite the popularity and success of the Minitel, it had some limitations. The terminal really was adapted best to the accessing data banks. Chatting was something that was squeezed in by users, and they never adapted the terminal to fully take advantage of this new functionality. Furthermore, there was no real attempt to develop asynchronous messaging, what we call email, or group interaction, social networking. It would have been difficult in any case. I actually tried, with the help of the phone company, to introduce group interaction, but we were not very successful. The original Minitel terminal was cheap to make, which was important because it was being given away free, but it had very little memory and the keyboard was quite crude. So it's a poor design, and they never really evolved it. The world of computing was evolving rapidly, but the Minitel was fossilized. And then there was also the problem of the protocol. The Minitel had a centralized computer doing all the switching and controlling the flow of data. And this meant that it depended completely on the French phone company, which operated that computer center. Whereas the internet has the advantage of not being national. the IP protocol of the internet allows anyone to hook up who just installs some software that contains the stack that enables you to communicate with the system. And so it's decentralized in a way that the French system was not, and therefore easier to sell internationally. And of course, by now it has sold even to France, where the Minitel system no longer operates. Now, for us, the most important point about this story is the role of users. When you introduce different actors, you get different designs. In this case, it was a question of technocrats versus ordinary users. The intervention of the users modified the design. The computer, which formerly had been available only for filing and data storage and calculation, became a communication device. This has to do with the question of meaning. What is a computer? What is a network? That will be decided in practice, not just by dictionary definition, but by how people use the system. So they moved from the original usage, data storage and calculation, by adding communication.